Before I continue, I'd like to say a big thank you to the organisers of the conference, in particular Maria del Pilar Caladine for the invitation to give this joint keynote, and for all the hard work that's gone into putting together what I'm sure will be a very stimulating and thought-provoking couple of days. Today then, I'd like to present a paper on the spatial imagination of indenture, and to put forward a method, the indentured archipelago, and with which to engage with the lived experiences of Indian indentured labourers across the multiple colonies of empire in which they laboured. In using such an historical geographical framework, I'm going to try and argue that the indentured archipelago as a method enables us to reimagine the transnational agency of 19th and early 20th century Indian indentured labourers. In this centenary year of the end of indentured transportation, I think viewing indenture through an archipelagic lens can offer much to a more nuanced geographical understanding of the movements of these men, women and children who cultivated that crop which satisfied the sweet tooth of the metropole. So in this paper, I'm going to show how imperial networks established between India and the sugar colonies of the British, French, Dutch and Danish empires to transport a regulated flow of indentured labourers were co-opted by independent subaltern efforts to re-indenture in multiple colonies, and show that these flows were supplemented by off-radar, clandestine networks that emerged between sugar colonies of different empires. In examining this little explored facet of indenture, I hope to try and bring to light the sinews of movements of a subaltern population which has been obscured by perhaps nationalistic accounts of one-way labour flows from India to particular colonies, and suggest that movement within the Indian indenture system was much more complex. So I argue that rather than experiencing the system of indenture in isolation, the colonies importing indentured labour were inserted into an indentured archipelago, comprising colonies across global regions. It was an archipelago that drew its composite parts into correspondence, debates, and sometimes economic conflict with each other. Using this archipelagic framework, I highlight the agency displayed by labourers, the networks they traversed, and the careers they developed and sustained. And by wearing this historical geographical hat and thinking in this way, we can avoid compartmentalising the indenture experiences of perhaps one individual colony, which can create artificial borders and stunt understanding of the system as a whole. Thinking in this way enables us to move beyond analysing indenture in an individual colony and view the system for what it really was, yet hardly ever described as, a more than national network which radically altered the spatiality of both the Indian labourers involved and the colonies they emigrated to and settled in. So during the archival fieldwork behind this research, what came to light was the interconnectedness of these indenture importing colonies. This presentation focuses on the experiences of the labourers who travelled between the colonies of this indentured archipelago, emphasising that interconnectedness of these seemingly disparate places. By bringing to light this geography, we're able to see the cross-colony lateral relationships that developed as a result of this, of course, one of the largest movements of labour of the last 2 centuries, that final push following the abolition of slavery for a legitimate labour force with which to keep the economies of these colonial possessions afloat. So literature on Indian indenture has traditionally been focused on the history of the system, on bringing to light the stories of individual labourers. One crucial aspect, however, perhaps has been neglected to date, and that's those interrelationships of colonial geographies. This concept hopefully allows for this wider geographic reading of the system. The colonies which used Indian indentured labour are of course well documented, and so the mobility of labourers from India to these colonies is unquestioned. Labourers travelled from India to the reaches of the Caribbean, the Pacific and Indian Oceans. This much is known and well written about, of course, and illustrates that transoceanic mobility of labourers. It is perhaps, though, a one-dimensional view. The neglect of geography, and of course the neglect perhaps by geographers in the study of Indian indenture, has given rise to a lack of attention paid on the transcolonial movements which played out across these colonies and beyond. And this can be traced from both the individual to the international scale. Between 1877 and 1912, at least 18,000 Indian indentured labourers remigrated between sugar colonies. And this table here shows remigrants who arrived in Mauritius on board one ship, the British Peer, in 1890, and the colonies they previously indentured in. Remigrants then were individuals who, having completed one tenure of indenture in a particular colony, elected to remigrate either to another or, having returned to India, back to the same one for a new indenture contract. Indian indentured labourers have been portrayed as easy to manipulate, perhaps apathetic even, and to an extent this is corroborated by some archival evidence. But this image of Indian indentured labourers has been reinforced and perhaps cast as the defining portrayal of these labourers. But again, it's only one part of the indenture story. The fact that thousands of immigrants to the sugar colonies arrived having indentured previously highlights an issue that we perhaps should contend with if we're to try and understand the system even more fully than we already do, and that is agency. So agency enables us to reimagine the lives of Indian indentured labourers and to bring the notion of what I've termed subaltern careering to life. There were many reasons why a labourer might have chosen to remigrate. The poor conditions they had left behind in India, the possibility of upward social mobility due to the absence of caste or the growing absence and availability of land to purchase, the steady income perhaps of an indenture contract, putting down roots in the colony, perhaps most contentiously of all, the concept of travel. The notion of careering across empire is explored by David Lambert and Alan Lester in their book Colonial Lives Across the British Empire, which focuses primarily on the movement of white colonial officials across empire. This work on subaltern careering aims to add to that concept by highlighting the movement of Indian indentured labourers, such as these four individuals, who remigrated across empire despite their colour, race and social standing, and perhaps successfully negotiated the oceanic corridors of transcolonial travel. Official statistics on remigrants were collected and reported by the Protector of Emigrants in Calcutta and published annually in reports. Here we see how the stats were reported for 1889. So as an example, in this year, 7 labourers who had previously worked in Fiji remigrated to Mauritius. Demerara, Guyana, was by far the largest recipient of remigrants during this period, the next largest being Trinidad, followed by Natal and Mauritius. These colonies proved to be favoured due to their possibility of buying land. Fiji became a popular destination for remigrants after 1900, when it increased its recruitment drive for labourers, at a time when other colonies were winding down. So what did this look like in practice? On the 14th of December 1889, a family of 7 arrived in Port Louis, Mauritius, on board the Chilka, a ship from Calcutta. Husband and wife, Jagannath and Raman, both 32, and their 5 sons, Gangaram, Mohabir, Gayadi, Davidin and Pancho. And Jagannath and 3 of his sons are pictured here in their arrival photographs taken in Port Louis. The family were from the village of Payagpur in the district of Barech, 50 kilometres from the India-Nepal border. The family had previously indentured in Britain's newest colony, Fiji. Jagannath had in fact been on board the very first ship carrying indentured labourers to Fiji, the Leonidas, which left Calcutta on the 4th of March 1879, arriving in Levuka 72 days later on the 15th of May. He was aged 22, and after spending several days anchored offshore, the 498 men, women and children on board the boats were eventually transferred to the island of Yanuka-Lailai, which was the quarantine station for arriving immigrants into Fiji. The labourers were kept for 90 days in quarantine, and on expiration of the quarantine, the immigrants were divided between employers. The majority were sent to Suva to work on public works, constructing the new capital. One planter took on 106 immigrants, and the remainder were allotted as house servants in Levuka, including the Jagannaths. On their arrival, they were indentured to J. Perry, and they stayed with him until the 15th of January 1880, when they were transferred to the Great Amalgamated Sugar Company. 10 months later, on the 14th of October, they were again transferred to the plantation of J.E. Mason on the island of Tabayuni. On the 15th of May 1883, Jagannath was convicted of an offence, though no details emerge in the archives as to what that conviction was for, or how long the sentence was. But the family re-emerged in the archives 3 years later, at the end of 1886, when the records show they moved to the Ellington estate, owned by Sunderland and Cotter, at Raki Raki, on the northern coast of Fiji's largest island, Viti Levu, where they indentured to work on the sugar plantations there. They didn't move alone. In fact, several of their shipmates, known as Jahaji Bhais and Jahaji Bahins, literally ship brothers and sisters from the voyage on board the Leonidas, with whom they laboured in Levuka, also went to Raki. Jagannath's indenture at the Ellington estate lasted 2.5 years. On the 3rd of May 1889, 10 years after they had arrived, the sail ship Moi arrived in Suva, carrying over 600 new labourers, another batch ready to be scattered across Fiji's islands. 11 days later, on the 14th of May, the Moi was towed out of Suva harbour, and it set sail again for its return voyage to Calcutta. On that ship was the Jagannath family. Pancho, who was 7 months old when the family arrived in Mauritius later that year, was either born just prior to leaving Fiji, or he was born on the ship, as the records show that there was one birth on board the Moi during its return trip to Calcutta. The Moi docked at Calcutta on the 28th of June, 47 days after leaving Fiji. The family's stay in India was brief, some 5 months. Perhaps they returned to their hometown of Payapur or stayed in Calcutta. There's no way of knowing, but what is certain is that they departed Calcutta once again on board the last ship of the season, the steamer Chilka, on the 28th of November 1889. They arrived in Mauritius, the star and key of the Indian Ocean, 16 days later on the 14th of December, the quickest ship journey to any colony from Calcutta that year. The Jagannaths had boarded a steamship, a new innovation on the emigration lines, and much quicker than all previous sail ships, some of which, like the Moi, still plied the routes to the colonies. Though the Chilka arrived in Mauritius just 16 days after leaving Calcutta, the labourers were not distributed until March the following year, indicating a stint of just less than 3 months spent in quarantine and at the depot. The family were indentured to the Belleton estate in the east of the island, in the district of Flack. In return for working 6 full days per week and 2 hours on Sundays, the family would receive 14 rupees per month, medical care and maintenance during sickness, a dwelling house, and weekly rations of rice, dal, saltfish, ghee, and salt. The family lived at the Sans Souci camp, a literal translation perhaps being carefree, and whilst this, like many other names of sugar estates and camps in Mauritius, exude a sense of irony, given their histories as first slave and then indentured plantations, the name of the estate does have a certain poignancy to it as the family started their new lives on the island. It would be wholly inappropriate to suggest the lives of the Jagannaths were carefree, but their voyages out across the Bay of Bengal, around Australia into the South Pacific, then back to Calcutta, and then deep into the southern Indian Ocean, make them some of the most mobile people of their time. The Jagannaths were just one family out of the 18,000 individuals who moved between colonies via India and who indentured in more than one colony. They utilised those transoceanic networks and corridors put in place by colonial authorities to forge their own transcolonial pathways. Remigrants, however, did not only travel via India. Many also travelled directly between the colonies. Private companies and governments of colonies not permitted to recruit indentured labourers from India latched onto the idea of recruiting labour from the pool of time-expired labourers in colonies who were allowed to receive indentured labourers directly from the subcontinent. So I suggest that Mauritius became a hub from which neighbouring colonies in the Indian Ocean tried to recruit from. Between 1875 and 1877, around 700 Mauritian time-expired labourers sailed directly to Natal to indenture there, as well as individuals recruited separately, such as this chap Dabby, who moved to Natal as a cook. In 1879, over 100 time-expired labourers in Mauritius were recruited to work for the railway and harbour works in neighbouring Reunion Island, where indentured immigration from India had been banned following reports of ill treatment. And throughout the 19th and early 20th century, there were applications for labourers in Mauritius to go to Madagascar, the Seychelles, and the Oil Islands, or today's Chagos Islands. It's no coincidence that by the last quarter of the 19th century, similar practices and business proposals were being suggested in Fiji. Just like Mauritius, it too had become the sole importer of Indian labour in its region. A request to hire Indians from Fiji to work in the New Hebrides was made to the Fijian administration, but refused on grounds of insufficient regulation in place. Individual Indian labourers from Fiji did, however, travel to the Australian colonies and New Zealand as employees of private individuals, such as this Indian woman from Fiji. And there were additional proposals to recruit labourers in Fiji to work in New Caledonia, the Solomon Islands, and Samoa, illustrating Fiji's central role in the South Pacific as a regional entrepot for recruiting Indian indentured labourers. The scale of ambition of recruitment proposals was not just regional. In the 1870s, labourers were transported directly by the French between Reunion in the Indian Ocean and New Caledonia in the Pacific. Following this, proposals were submitted to both the Mauritian and Fijian administration to transport time-expired labourers directly from Mauritius to the Pacific. In 1876, Adolphe de Plevitz, a Mauritian planter who many of you may have heard of, who moved to Fiji, requested permission from the Fijian governor to transport Mauritian labourers to the islands. 5 years later, the Mauritian company Blythe & Co. requested the Mauritian administration whether they could send Mauritian labourers to Fiji and Queensland. Whilst both requests were ultimately denied, not all were. In 1877, 119 men, women and children were recruited in Mauritius to work on the sugar estates of Viscount Mauer in Brazil. They worked at the estates for 2 years before being repatriated back to Mauritius after complaining of not being paid to the British consul in Rio de Janeiro, though some elected to stay on in Brazil and Uruguay. These examples illustrate the wider geographies of the Indian indenture system. Madagascar, Queensland, the New Hebrides, New Caledonia, Brazil, all territories not usually included in discussion on Indian indenture, but which if neglected, could hinder our understanding of the geography of the system. The forays of Indian labourers to territories not formally part of the system, such as Brazil or New Caledonia or Madagascar, as well as the movement of labourers between colonies of the indentured archipelago via India, such as the Jagannath family, illustrate the agency of this group of people who have traditionally been viewed as mere pawns in this Hugh Tinker, of course, wrote a new system of slavery. By the end of the 19th century, Indian indentured labourers could be found, of course, in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And several initiatives, some of which I've talked about in this presentation, took Indian indentured labourers to colonies not traditionally linked to the indenture system. The majority of the proposed initiatives were unrealised, coming from places as diverse as Guatemala, North Borneo and the Sandwich Islands, today's Hawaii. And here you can see just how different a map of Indian labour looks, taking into account the movement of non-sanctioned labour emigration and proposals. Other places, particularly in the Americas, such as the United States, Canada, Argentina, Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Uruguay, issued statements strictly prohibiting the movement of Indian labourers to their shores. So the aim of this presentation has been to pull together inherently geographic aspects of the Indian indenture system, which has come to light during the last half of the indenture era, so from the 1870s to 1917, under the concepts of the indentured archipelago and subaltern careering. In doing so, distinct themes emerge: the agency demonstrated by labourers on their decisions to remigrate, the oceanic nature of proposals of new migratory routes between colonies, revealing a much different picture of Indian labour migration than one that we've perhaps become accustomed to. This paper hopes to begin a rewriting of the historical geography of the Indian indenture system, challenging the accepted geography of the system. In doing so, the research hopefully makes a contribution to the way in which we think of subaltern populations in terms of agency and careering, and asks us to rethink the global post-slavery labour markets which evolved during the 19th and early 20th century. Indian indenture has long been viewed as a substitute for slavery, but hopefully this research illustrates that, although with control and regulation, of course, indentured labourers could become decision-making and mobile agents in their own right. Thank you very much.
Right, so I'd like to thank the organisers and my dear friend and colleague Maria for her sheer commitment to organising today's proceedings and for also giving me and my fellow early career researchers this platform. And thank you to SAS for hosting Indenture Abolition 100. So, yes, the title has changed slightly from Race and Romance because I have no romance in my life. So, I'd rather talk about my reflections on colorism as a legacy of colonialism and link that to post-indentureship. It occurred to me recently that despite being a global phenomenon, not everybody's actually familiar with this term, let alone the concept. So I'd like to put this into some context by reading a small extract from a respondent I interviewed in Trinidad a few years ago during my fieldwork. And she says, She says, in the Caribbean, there's still that struggle for colour. Maybe because colour here gives you some sort of status. When I started teaching preschool about 3 years ago, I went for an interview and there was an Indian woman. It wasn't an interview, basically I just got the job. It was later on I heard one of the teachers saying, well, she's a pretty Indian girl. So you know, if you go somewhere, people probably recognize you based on your colour because, I mean, you may look a particular way, whatever the case, but it has some sort of social status. So what Lisa here, in my view, is basically describing at a very basic level is a process of colorism, sometimes referred to as the insidious cousin of racism. Colorism is rooted in this idea that whiter is more powerful and therefore better or more ideal, and the discrimination of a person based solely on their skin colour. Now this has a long-standing legacy in the Caribbean. In Trinidad, the colonial race-colour-class hierarchy played a significant role in the making and embedding of attitudes in the larger society. Colonial history placed people of colour beneath white people in this racial hierarchy, so the concept of skin colour was naturalised and normalised as a point of meaningful distinctions between people, particularly in matters of love and intimacies. I suggest that these distinctions carried through post-slavery and continue to carry, in present times. In a country sometimes cited as the Callaloo nation, where the mixed aesthetic is seen as the most desirable and idealized, I was curious as to how the majority of women that I spoke to, who claim that their romantic preferences are something innate and personal to each of us, that there was an overwhelming preference towards whiteness. And I don't mean this as a racial category, but as a privileged subject position which operates in very implicit ways. So it could be said that colonial ideas of colour continue to inform contemporary engagement of beauty and desirability, and briefly we'll talk about how. When I have touched upon the subject of race and colorism in some spaces, the first question I'm immediately asked is why Trinidad, given that my ancestry is Mauritian and Indian? Well, the short answer is you would be hard-pressed to find any work of this in Mauritius, despite the fact that the two countries share a similar colonial and indentureship history. That's not to say that colorism does not operate in Mauritius, but I came across a very limited number of studies that talk about this in any meaningful way, but rather as a vague, abstract concept, and not rooted in any kind of real-life examples. My fieldwork in Trinidad, however, painted a very different picture, especially with the young women that I interviewed, giving me detailed accounts of what you could classify as microaggressions of colorism in their lives, and virtually all of them referred to the racial order of the colonial times as laying the foundation of racial antagonism and colorism as we see it today. From an academic/theoretical standpoint, I would like to position this discussion under what Gabrielle Hussein and Lisa Uta call a post-indenture feminist thought. Because this is a post-indentureship gendered reality for a lot of young women in Trinidad, and I imagine a number of other former colonies, and that is that the idea that the colour of their skin has material effects. Indian communities, whether from India or in other regions, have a preference for fair skin, but most people do not acknowledge the practices of exclusion and discrimination that would easily fall under this remit of colorism. However, some people have started to acknowledge this. For example, one young woman I spoke to, Rhea, said that, I think in Trinidad most people view beauty according to your skin colour. Yeah, the fairer, the more beautiful you are. Ashley in the same discussion said, it's not that my mum wanted me to be white or I'd want my children to be. It's that you want them to have access to the benefits or privileges of whiteness. And I think people don't understand this. Cherise in the same focus group says, it does give you some sort of social status in Trinidad. This is why we try to preserve our skin colour. So you could say this is how skin colour as a form of social capital works for some of these women. Fairer skin does confer advantages, and that is widely valued, is something to be concerned about. That it also has material effects is something Cindy explained, and the extent to how colorism permeated her personal life. She says, I never thought about it until you asked me. I am dark. I don't know much about my family or which part of India they came from. I found out recently they were from South, and reading books on indentureship at school, I know most of the Indians here come from the North, right? And I said yes. And she went on to say, well, I never have an Indian boy. I don't live in an Indian area. I know some from school and we line, but I never have a relationship. One boy told me one time, I don't date dark girls, but you're real cute. I tell him, well, where to go? I knew I would not marry an Indian boy. I don't fit their idea of Indian. What you are all saying is right. We have a real obsession with colour in the Caribbean. I never have any problems with black fellas. I'm married to one. I find more acceptance with these guys. I know they have the same problem too with skin bleaching and all, but my own experience, I just attract more African boys. I don't think it's a race thing, it's my colour, or maybe both. And I asked her, well, was that a conscious decision for you? I mean, did you decide for yourself that this is my skin colour, so I can't be with an Indian, or was it something that your family influenced? How did this come about? And she said, no, my family were not happy at all. But they knew the problems, and they know what Indians are like. And they also became more relaxed the older they got. They always tell me, look at the boy's heart, not his colour. We fell in love, but I think if I was liked by Indians, or not this colour I am, my family would have never let me marry my husband. They say this, but deep down they would prefer an Indian. They knew what you call high colour boys would not find me attractive, so they accepted it in the end. It was just like that. I personally found that extract touching, and there are a whole lot more similar narratives that I came across during my time there that I won't be able to go into now. But what Cindy went on to describe in greater detail was the exclusion she came across from the wider Indian community around her once she did get married. And that could be linked to the anxieties around black Indian mixing, which has a historical precedent. But it was interesting to me how the intimate lives of Indian Trinidadian young women are more regulated than that of their male peers. And this process of regulating and controlling was something that was very much enacted in the indentureship period. It did also make me think, if this year marks the 100th anniversary of the end of indentureship, then colorism and racialization as an unfortunate legacy in the wake of colonialism is a rippling effect. There are rippling effects on the descendants as the roles they have played in formulating their communities have at once changed, but not changed at the same time. So you could say there's this process of fixity and fluidity that runs simultaneously. And this is something that becomes very clear in the gender roles and norms that are enacted and reenacted, and it's something which Professor Patricia Mohammed has explored in her work in a lot more detail. So my reflections on social life post-indentureship, not just in relation to today's events, but over some time, made me come to one conclusion, one of many conclusions, but one I'll share with you today. And that is that there is an emerging dismantling of the culture of silence. Because there does exist a conservative Indian mode of thinking that defaults to correcting instead of connecting. Again, not just in Trinidad, but in a lot of post-indenture Indian communities worldwide. When I first interviewed the young women and asked about anything to do with race, the immediate line from all of them was how they celebrated the fact that they live in a mixed nation and celebrated connectedness. But then slowly they went on to reveal when it came to things like dating, marriage, friends, circles, community, a lot of ideas that have come from previous generations do permeate and in turn reinforce some of the colonial attitudes to skin color, gender, race, among other identity markers. Staying far too insulated in one's tightly knit networks only serves to make realize that the nation isn't perhaps as progressive as we hoped it to be, and this is something they eventually acknowledged. They did also eventually open up and speak about a number of incidents that happened to them or their friends, from harassment, misogyny, exclusion, rejection, name-calling, all of which by their own acknowledgement was rooted in some sort of racial bias. Being told no boy will marry you because of your skin or what occupations you can have, where you will or will not live, is not only disheartening, it can be damaging to a person's sense of self and self-esteem. And whereas before there was a culture of silence around this, I believe this is changing. Events like today, for example, and hopefully more to come, is just one of many ways of how to talk about generational trauma or the social constructions of our bodies. as well as the lingering effects of these, as I've tried to briefly show in this talk. I think it would be a more productive endeavour rather than taking the attitude of, oh, it's in the past and we've moved on, because something I've personally, and this is a line of thought I've encountered many times, but really I do question, and I think we should all continue to question, how much have we moved on and how can we progress further? Because if we have progressed to such a degree, why is it that there's still an overwhelming preference towards whiteness? That's one image. So, colorism and other forms of discrimination are often related to power structures operating at the level of state, domestic, sexual, racial, colonial, and neoliberal. But that also connects post-colonial lives. I would like to highlight here that though my focus is on post-indenture Indians, there are a multitude of points of connection and solidarity, not just with other old diasporic Indian communities, but with black communities too. And that ties into what Reshaad was talking about, colonial geographies, so I thought that was interesting. And I think in doing so, that could affect generational change. As I and many intersectional scholars believe, differences in race, colour, class and creed that divided us into tribes was a colonial legacy, but these can be overcome not just behind closed doors, but to truly take action whenever life presents us with an opportunity to prove ourselves. And I truly do believe that there is a generation who's challenging the other, much like our ancestors did when they left India and made that journey across the Kala Pani. When I look through some of the narratives of the Jahajis, I can't help but think how that one choice to board the ship did change their lives. And yes, they endured hardships, afflictions, abuse, but they were able to overcome a lot through love, right? We don't see those stories or moments in a lot of the literature on this, but I'm sure they are there, they exist. Love is one of those few things where we can overcome a lot of societal fears and hierarchies, as some have. But where is love in post-indenture culture? And what about self-love? We know the Indian indentees in struggle, but how are they in pleasure or at peace? And what of their descendants? Respectability has often been deployed as a framework in the scholarly analysis of this community, and continues to be. But what about anti-respectability, sex positivity, or to use a common buzzword, the nasty woman? So, in sum, this is where I'd like to conclude with somewhat of a call to action. We need more stories that talk about these, that offer alternative glimpses and perspectives, new stories and contributions to the study of indentureship, to spend time in the musty archives or even on online spaces, which is what I've done, running after snippets of information, being surprised again and again, and ultimately giving voice, not to an academic pursuit, but to real people who lived and breathed, who were part of my history and might be part of how you came to be as well.
I heartily thank the organizers of the conference, and especially Maria Kaladin for inviting us, me and my colleagues, to be part of this joint keynote at this international conference on the centenary of the end of the indenture. Thank you, Reshaad and Kavyta, for the amazing presentations. My presentation is entitled Colonial Violence on Women in Mauritius During Indenture, and the mother wounds that we carry. I think that's really follows from your paper. It is based on a very personal research started almost a decade ago, where I retrace my matrilineal ancestry. My ongoing PhD research on decoloniality, which looks at creative practices of resistance against residues of colonialism, allowed me to interweave facts from historical archives with the critical fabulation of my own genealogy. On my trip to Mauritius last August, I spent some time at Ladora, a village at the foot of one of the most beautiful mountain range of the island. An agricultural and residential location, I woke up every morning to the view of the bluish-green mountains emerging from the clouds. While I was on a holiday and happy to be far from bustled London for a few weeks, I could not help noticing the gendered agricultural spaces below, where women, some quite old, were laboring the immense fields of vegetables which replaced sugarcane plantations. I could see them as small figures already at work at dawn under the imposing mountains. Rainy mornings, windy mornings, cold mornings, they were always there. And when I started to know the families and neighbors around, I found out that they were all of Indian origins. I saw women slowly walking across the fields with huge heavy baskets of vegetables, potatoes, shushu, greens, pumpkins, cucumber, which they carried diligently until they reached the lorry. I was at various moments stunned by how men seemed to supervise the work, waiting in the lorry and beckoning women to do this and that. 50 years after independence, although no longer under colonial rule, the scene remains unapologetically similar to when Indian women and those born in the colony labored in the 19th and 20th century. This observation, in many ways, allowed me to interweave the past and the present. Like a visual residue of the past, which I took to the archives and transposed on reports and research, where I collected testimonies of physical labor, which many of us would find very difficult to undertake today. Some of those testimonies, we had to walk on the mardi, wooden plank, to put the cane in the corbeille, cane garrow. It was very exhausting work for ladies like us. We had to put the cane on our head and walk along the mardi, which was very high. We often used to fall down too. When the Siada asked us to remove dibe, which is a straw from sugarcane, especially kankulu, we would run away because these dibe pierced our old socks, hands and fingers. We also used to get rashes. These women, interviewed in their old age, still remembered the hard work. They revealed that they were not given gloves or any protective clothing. They found it difficult to cook and look after their families after a day's work because of the injuries they sustained to their hands. Tasks such as manuring, weeding, and removing straw from cane was usually performed by women or a third group of workers consisting of women, children, and invalids, and was used as justification for paying them less than men. They were also paid much less because they often came without an indenture contract to settle men, which was a bigger phenomenon in Mauritius than the other colonies. Mauritius was the only sugar colony that witnessed the recruitment of Indian women as wives to settle men and were thus not given an indentured contract. While Mauritius is known for being a post-independence economic miracle, I cannot help ask, upon whose miraculous backs does this economic progress and prosperity depend on? Retracing my matrilineal ancestry was a way for me to understand the lives of Mauritian women who so far I have strongly believed have moved from their indentured past of hard labor on the plantation. Yet, residues of colonialism and plantation mentality found in hierarchies of power, gendered spaces, systems of exploitation, accumulation and consumption, and I can relate to your paper on racism, colorism, and other of those issues, remain entrenched in our everyday lives. My first Indian mother was called Uchama. She had a number, 297047. She came as a spouse, as per the colonial archive. She was 26. She left Raja Mahendravaram, one of the largest cities of the East Godavari districts, and the birthplace of the 11th century poet Nanaya Bhattaraka, from which the grammar and script of the Telugu language and literature evolved. She made a 600-kilometer road journey to the port of Chennai and arrived on the War Eagle on the 28th January 1863. It has been well documented that most women who embarked on the indentured journey were widows and single women, and they showed a definite interest in paid work and their independence, and thus preferred other destinations than Mauritius. I can only speculate whether Uchama was married before, had previous children, was harassed into indenture, was promised a husband in the depot or on the ship to be eligible to the recruiter, was forced into the arrangement, or whether she came, as David Davidine's Rohini in his novel The Counting House, as a married wife, happy to start a new, better life in the colony. I found out that only a small fraction of Indian women in Mauritius had independent income, and the majority, which consists of 1/3 of the 500,000 indentured Indian, the gender ratio being 12 to 1 in the beginning, who were sent to the colony, did unwaged work at home. Women were hence easily dismissed, silenced, and bore the mental and physical burden of raising children for the colony. In the 1870s, the Royal Commission noted the practices in Mauritius of 4 or 5 men subsidizing themselves to maintain a woman who acts in the capacity of wife or mistress to each one of them in turn, an arrangement which leads to quarrels, violence, wife murders, and bloodshed. Initially, men were apparently not allowed to beat up their wife because she did not belong to him for the 5 years of indenture. The colonial system of ownership and struggles for power was, however, well rooted in the family structure. Once the contract was over and women became tied to children born in the colony, making it financially difficult to go back, which was precisely the strategies of indentureship. The first form of violence to indentured women lies in the precarity of their condition, the unfamiliarity with the strategies of colonialism, on the expandability of their bodies, valued to settle men, their emotional, mental, and physical dependence on their men carers, and the broken matrifocal communities of care which left them at the mercy of the patriarchal colony. In many ways, the indenture colony was not far removed from the 1804 Code Napoleon, backed by the Catholic Church and characterized by severe patriarchalism, which imposed the status of minor on a married woman, restricting her to the private domestic sphere and classifying her as incompetent as children, the insane, and criminals. It restricted women's legal and civil rights, made married women economically and legally subject to their husbands, and declared that they belonged to the family, not to public life. This legislation also forbade women to attend political meetings or to wear trousers. The first woman in Mauritian history who represents resistance system of oppression is Anna of Bengal, which goes back to the 17th century under Dutch slavery. Of Indian origin, she is known to have set fire with 2 other runaway slaves to the Dutch settlement. I thought that I should mention her name, although she comes pre-indenture. By focusing on the mothers who came before me, I was able to picture the specificities of violence which women particularly endured within safer spaces. I noticed how the news in Mauritius was full of gory, chilling stories of physical violence on women, torture, beating, stabbing, sexual violence, many in the domestic space itself. The last report on gender-based violence in Mauritius reached the conclusion that one quarter of women have experienced some form of violence at least once in their lifetime. According to the research, this number, which is based on reported cases, presupposes that 2 or 3 times more women is subjected to form of violence on the island, but remain silent due to the conservatism of society. Contemporary literature continues to prove that colonialism, since 1492, cemented the foundation of an imperialist, racist, capitalist patriarchy across continents, and that the residues seem to reverberate in even more intensified ways in our everyday present lives. So, coming back to Uchama, the first woman to have landed in Mauritius within my matrilineal ancestry, had my great-great-grandmother Mariama at the age of 40 and died at the age of 62. The colonial archive reveals her death on the sugar estate where her daughter seemed to have left for. when she herself got married to a South Indian man from Chikkakol Punjab, who initially came as a child. She died the same year that her daughter was pregnant with her first child. The estate in question was the Grande Rosalie estate, the 18th century centerpiece of the French Empire in the colony, with the dwellings of the governor and his entourage in the days of the East India Company, and passed down to descendants of French settlers under British administration. From fragments of information collected, I imagine Mariama living in the humble lodgings provided for Indian workers at the backyard of the plantation space, and her children destined to work either in the colonial house or in the fields. My great-grandmother was born on that estate. On my last trip, I drove around the Grande Rosalie area and has been struck by the gated enclaves of bourgeois white privilege which still occupy this wide stretch of land. I also noticed side doors opening to women of Indian and African origins, who probably work as cleaners, carers, and receptionists. A plantation mentality well in place in contemporary Mauritius. The colonial violence of exclusion and labor exploitation based on color and gender remain embedded in the post-colonial geography of the island, which reminded me of the testimonies collected by the Truth and Justice Commission, which was set up in 2009 to make an assessment of the consequences of slavery and indentured labor during the colonial period up to the present. During indenture, women who were mothers themselves worked as maids. They were called tininen or graninen, little or big nanny, sewers, seasonal workers in factories, and planted peanuts dans la cour blanc in the white household. Testimonies reveal that their parents or grandparents have worked for white people. They feel they have been oppressed. They describe the conditions of life as that of slaves and modern slaves. Women were servants and worked 24/7 for their masters, going to campement, bungalows with them, taking care of their children, but were ill-treated for some of them. They slept under the table, and when their family lived independence, their children had to be shut in the house so as not to disturb the masters. In 1908, while my great-grandmother Nilama, poetically meaning Blue Mother, was 4, and her youngest brother 1-year-old, 2 Indian workers set fire to a range of huts at that estate in protest of the working conditions. From the archives, one of them seemed to have claimed that he was a silversmith and was not recruited to work in the fields. The official documents stating that they wanted to have their contracts cancelled. The violence of and in the colony and the harshness of the work imposed on Indians can be imagined for the high rate of suicide recorded on the island, where taking one's life was considered more humane than slaving under servitude and inhumane practices. For women as well, the only alternative to an oppressed life was either sex work or suicide. For my great-grandmother, supported by her mother, it was finding the right husband who could take her out of the plantation structure and mentality. After one abusive husband and another one who passed away, and returning to her mother in between each dysfunctional marriage, she was married to a siadar, and an entrepreneur family in Quartier Militaire in the 20s, a village outside the sugarcane estates, where she birthed and mothered 9 children. From my grandmother's sister, I found out that she led the submissive life of a daughter-in-law, but became ferociously demanding at the marriage proposals of her own daughters. In many ways, the hierarchies of the plantation was also internalized in the private sphere, with the mother-in-law sometimes acting out the power which is denied to her as a girl, wife, and mother, and in that sense perpetrates patriarchal violence. Marriage was nevertheless a means of social mobility, and a good one could minimize the precarity of the daughter's life, as there were not many ways that women in the plantation colony of Mauritius could acquire financial independence. A good marriage also meant the possibility of being a housewife and taking care of the family instead of working for the white people. This mentality, despite being advantageous for some at that point in colonial history, would result in domestic abuse for many others, as can still be seen in contemporary Mauritius. My own grandmother, born a few years after the end of indenture, was the eldest daughter and was sent off to a man of South Asian ancestry of a rising bourgeoisie. My great-grandmother expressed deep regret for marrying her to a family who with the complicity of the husband, kept hidden a relationship with a woman of African origin, with whom a daughter was born. The division and prejudices which prevail between people of Indian and African descent have been well documented in indenture studies, and which you have covered as well. The lack of solidarity is still present today. My grandmother seemed to have been isolated in her new household, where she had 8 children, not counting the miscarriages, in utter agony, I was told. My mother being the 7th born, whom she could barely breastfeed and take care of due to undiagnosed chronic illness and exhaustion. Unsupported by the family-in-law and far from her family, she died at the age of 26, a few days after giving birth, leaving 8 motherless children behind. This was the reality for many women of the early 20th century in Mauritius. Domestic abuse still provoking great concern today within my own family and across the country. It was her daughter, my aunt, who would later be subjected to a violence, which I still remember so vividly, from a traumatic scene witnessed when I was 9 years old. In the mid-30s, Mauritian society was transformed by a rising workers' consciousness and the movement of decolonization. In the midst of political movement and resistance, which followed, my grandmother's younger sister could break the predetermined path imposed on women and follow tertiary education in nearby French department Réunion Island. This was, however, not the case for other women who still labored within the sugar plantation. The story of Gitanjali Pyndiah, which is now being highlighted more prominently within national discourses of commemoration, is perhaps a highlight of the colonial violence which women were subjected to. In 1943, during a confrontation of laborers and the colonial police, which occurred at a sugar estate, Gitanjali, who was pregnant at the time and who was among the protesters, was shot by the police together with 3 other workers. She was left bleeding on the ground until trade unionists from her village came and collected her body. I would not want to end my presentation on such a grim depiction, while we are all here present to commemorate the end of the indenture system. And I thank you, Reshaad, for being very much more positive about the agency of those who came under the system. Like we see on every continent, women continue to resist oppressive systems and structures. Mauritius is not different. During indenture, women were active in barricades and in madrasas, places which were set up to provide education to the Indian people in their own mother tongues. Like Gitanjali Pyndiah, a few women activists continue to denounce the violence of present coloniality, which still perpetuates the post-independence Raghunandan nation. In many ways, we are all united here to celebrate the end of a system which replaced slave labor with another form of dehumanizing exploitation. But we are also here to rehumanize the scarred colonial geography which we have inherited. Thank you for your attention.